Some folks come west to be found. She came to be forgotten, and I was the only one who ever guessed why. I've kept the books on Silas Cade's ranch for 11 years. Cattle in one column, debts in another, dead men in a third that only I ever saw. I thought I knew every ugly thing that man had done before God and the territory. Then a wagon rolled up my road one October evening carrying a woman he'd paid $40 for, sight unseen, and I watched a gunslinger who'd never flinched at a loaded barrel go pale at the sight of a girl who couldn't have weighed 100 pounds soaking wet. She said her name was May. She said very little else. But I keep a ledger, friend, and a ledger doesn't lie the way a mouth does. And the longer she stayed, the more I understood that Silas hadn't bought a bride at all. He'd bought the last person alive who had a reason to see him dead. The rain started the same hour she did, and I've never been able to separate the two in my memory since. I was standing under the porch overhang with the day's tally still wet in my ledger. 19 head moved to the north pasture, 2 lame, 1 calf we'd likely lose by morning, when I heard the wagon before I saw it. You learn the sounds of a road out here. A hired wagon has a different rattle than a neighbor's. A stranger drives slower, unsure of the ruts. This one came slow. Silas heard it too. He came out of the house buttoning a clean shirt, which told me plenty. Silas Cade owned 4 shirts and wore 3 of them into rags. The clean one came out for church, which he didn't attend, and for burying, which he did too often. He'd put it on for her. "You expecting company?" I said, not a question I already knew. "Mind your books, Elias." "Books are minded. 19 north, 2 lame, and you've got shaving soap on your ear." He wiped at it, missed, glared at me, got it on the second try. 41 years old that autumn and nervous as a boy at his first dance. I'd have found it funny if the whole thing hadn't sat so wrong with me from the start. A man doesn't send off to a broker in San Francisco for a wife the way he orders a plow blade. But Silas had, back in the summer after a winter that had nearly broken him, and a loneliness that had been breaking him longer than that. $40 and a promise of passage. A name on a paper. He wouldn't talk about it beyond that, and I'd learned across 11 years which subjects earned you a closed door. The wagon came into the yard through a curtain of rain going silver in the last of the light. The driver was a Chinese man of middle years in a soaked felt hat, and beside him sat a shape wrapped in an oiled canvas, so that at first I took her for freight. Then the canvas moved, and a face looked out from under it, and I forgot to breathe for a second. I want to be careful how I tell this because I've heard the way men in saloons talk about women who don't look like their mothers, and I won't have it in my accounting. She was young, younger than the paper had likely promised, though I'd never know for certain. She had a stillness to her that most young people haven't earned yet, rain on her face, and she didn't wipe it. She looked at the house. She looked at the barn. She looked at Silas standing on his porch in his church shirt, and something crossed her face so fast that if I hadn't spent 11 years reading the small print in men's expressions, I'd have missed it entirely. It wasn't fear. I'd expected fear. A girl sold across an ocean to a stranger, she's got every right to it. It was recognition, just a flicker, gone before it fully arrived. I marked it the way I mark everything, filed it, told myself I'd imagined it. The driver climbed down and spoke to Silas in careful English, the words of a man who'd learned the language for business and no other reason. This was the woman from the arrangement. Here were her papers. Here was the receipt for the balance owed, which Silas paid out of a tin without counting, because counting in front of her would have shamed them both. The driver helped her down. She came off the wagon light, favoring her right ankle just slightly, and stood in the mud in shoes that had never been meant for mud, holding a single cloth bundle against her chest like it was the last warm thing in the world. "Elias," Silas said, his voice had gone rough, "get her inside. Out of the wet." So I did. Her name, she told us at the table, was May. She said it plainly, touching her own collarbone. When Silas said his own name back to her, Silas, then Cade, then Silas again like he wasn't sure which she'd need, she repeated only the first, quietly testing it. Silas. She had more English than the driver's manner had led me to expect, though she rationed it like water on a long ride. Yes, no, thank you, cold. She understood far more than she spoke. I saw that in the way her eyes moved ahead of the conversation, arriving at meaning before the slow among us did. I made a supper of what we had: beans, cornbread gone a day stale, coffee. She ate slowly and completely, and she thanked me for the plate with a small bow of her head that made me feel, absurdly, like I'd done something worth thanking. Silas barely ate at all. He kept looking at her and then looking away, a man who'd wanted something for so long that having it turned out to be its own kind of terror. I'll tell you the thing I noticed, because noticing is the only trade I've ever been good at. She watched his hands, not his face, which is where a nervous new bride watches, gauging temper and intent. She watched his hands where they rested on the table, the right one especially, the one with the old white scar running across 2 knuckles, the one that had done all the things I kept in the 3rd column of my ledger. She watched it the way you'd watch a snake that hadn't yet decided about you. And once, when he reached for the coffee pot and his sleeve rode up to show the faded ink of a tattoo he'd gotten in a life he never spoke of, a life before the ranch, before me, in some army or some prison or some place equally unkind, her whole body went still. Still as held breath, still as a woman who has just confirmed something she traveled 4,000 miles to confirm. Then she reached for her own coffee, and the moment closed over like water over a stone, and I told myself again that I was an old man inventing stories in the rain. That night I gave up my room, since a bride and groom who were strangers to each other needed the main bed, and I'd not sleep an inch closer to that awkwardness than the bunkhouse allowed. I lay awake a good while listening to the rain thin out to nothing. I heard no sounds from the house that a man might expect or dread. Only once, near midnight, the creak of the porch boards, and when I rose and looked out the bunkhouse window, I saw her. May, standing on the porch in the dark with her bundle still clutched to her chest, looking east, toward the road, toward the 4,000 miles she'd come. She stood there a long time. I didn't go to her. Some griefs you're not invited to. In the morning, she was making breakfast, as though she'd made it in that kitchen 100 times, and Silas was watching her with an expression I can only call hope, which is a hard thing to watch on the face of a man you've seen do hard things, and I opened my ledger to the day's work and found I could not quite make the numbers add. Here is what I knew about Silas Cade in those first days, and what I'd have written if anyone had asked me to swear to his character. I knew he'd come to the territory with money that had blood on it, and had spent 15 years trying to wash the money clean by working himself half to death on ground that fought him every season. I knew he'd killed men. The 3rd column held 4 names I was certain of, and a note that read others, unknown. I knew that he'd never once, in 11 years, raised a hand to a soul on this ranch who hadn't drawn on him first. I knew he paid a fair wage and buried the men who died in his service with his own hands and his own words, poor as those words were. I knew he woke some nights shouting in a language of pure fear that had no words in it at all. I knew, in short, that he was a man trying to become something better than his history, and failing gracefully, and that I'd thrown my lot in with him because I'd decided long ago that the trying counted for more than most men gave it credit for. What I did not know, what took me most of that first month to even begin to see, was that May knew everything about him that I knew, and more, and that she had known it before she ever set foot in his yard. The first real crack came at the end of October. A man rode up the road one afternoon, Del Harmon, from the freight office in town, bringing a letter and a bit of gossip he couldn't hold. The gossip was about a killing 3 years back at a rail camp east of here, one of those winter camps where men died and nobody counted too carefully. Chinese labor camp, mostly. There'd been a dispute over payment, or over a woman, or over nothing at all. The story changed with the teller, and some hired guns had come through and settled it the way hired guns settle things. Bodies in the snow. Del told it lightly, the way men tell things that happen to people they've decided don't quite count. I watched Silas's face while Del talked, and I saw it close like a door. And I watched May, who stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish rag in her hands, and I saw her face do the opposite. I saw it open just for a breath, just wide enough for me to see the thing living underneath, and what lived underneath was not grief, though grief was in it. What lived underneath was purpose. She looked at Silas's closed-door face. She looked at his scarred right hand, gone tight around the porch rail. And I understood all at once and too late the shape of the thing I'd been half seeing since the wagon. She hadn't been sold to Silas Cade by accident. Somebody had chosen him, or she had. That night I did a thing I'm not proud of. I waited until Silas was asleep and I went to the little shelf where she kept her cloth bundle, the one she'd carried off the wagon, the one she took to the porch at night. She was at the well. I had a minute, no more. I unfolded it with hands that shook, because I'm a bookkeeper and not a thief, and my body knew the difference even when my curiosity didn't. Inside was a comb. A woman's things, small and worn, a packet of letters in characters I couldn't read, and wrapped in a square of red silk so that I nearly missed it, a single object that stopped my hands cold. A photograph, a tintype, the kind they made cheap in the camps for men who wanted to send their faces home. A young man in it, Chinese, unsmiling the way you had to be for the long exposure, but with something in the set of his shoulders that even in that stiff pose looked like he'd been about to laugh. Her brother. Had to be. The resemblance was there in the eyes, in the stillness. And on the back, in the same characters as the letters, a line I couldn't read but didn't need to. I folded it all back exactly as I'd found it. I put the bundle where it had been. I went out to the bunkhouse and I sat with my ledger and I did not open it, because for the first time in 11 years I was afraid of what I might have to write in the third column. She had come 4,000 miles for the man who'd made her a photograph instead of a brother. And Sila's poor, hopeful, terrible Sila's, buttoning his clean shirt, had no idea at all who he'd let into his house. I heard her come back from the well. I heard the porch boards. I heard her stand out there in the dark the way she did every night looking east. I understood now. She wasn't looking toward the 4,000 miles she'd come. She was looking toward the ground, or she meant to leave a body when she was done. I didn't sleep that night, and I've never fully forgiven the version of me that spent those dark hours deciding what to do. Because that man weighed a killer's life against an innocent's grief like they were two columns to be balanced, and found that he could not make them add either. Toward dawn, I made myself a decision that wasn't much of one. I'd watch. I'd wait, I'd keep my books. And if the day came that she reached for more than a coffee cup, I'd have to decide then which of the two people under that roof I was willing to lose, the man who'd earned killing, or the woman who'd earned the right to do it. I closed the ledger. The lame calf had died in the night, same as I'd predicted. I marked it down. One small true thing in a morning that had come apart in my hands. Out in the yard, May was drawing water, and Sila's had come out to help her carry it. And from the bunkhouse window, I watched a gunslinger take a full pail from the hands of the woman who'd crossed an ocean to kill him. And I watched him smile at her like a man who'd finally, after all his sins, been given something good. I have thought about that smile every day since. The winter that came down on us that year was the kind old men used to frighten young ones, and it did a thing I never expected. It kept her hand from the knife by the simple fact that none of us could afford to die of anything but the cold. You cannot murder a man in December on a high ranch and survive it. The nearest law was 40 miles and the nearest neighbor 12, and a woman alone in that country in that season was a corpse the snow simply hadn't finished making yet. Whatever May had come to do, the mountains told her plainly she'd have to wait to do it, and I watched her accept that the way she seemed to accept everything, with a stillness that I'd stopped mistaking for peace. So we three lived through the dark months in a house too small for the secret I was keeping, and the strange thing, the thing I still can't fully square, is that they were not unhappy months. I'll tell it honest, because honest is all I've got to offer. She was good in that house. Not good the way a hired thing is good, earning its keep. Good the way a person is good who has decided, for reasons of her own, to be fully present in a life she never chose. She learned our ways and taught us hers. She took my bad coffee and made it into something a man looked forward to with a bit of something in it she'd carried in a twist of paper. Ginger, I learned later, and I've not been able to drink coffee without missing it since. She found Silas's shouting nights and did not flee them. The first time it happened after she came, I heard her rise, and I braced myself at the bunkhouse window for I don't know what. For the knife, God help me. For the perfect chance of a man lost in his own terror. Instead I heard her voice. Low, steady, not words he'd understand, just sound the way you'd gentle a frightened horse, and the shouting stopped. I sat down on my bunk and put my face in my hands, because I did not understand what I was watching, and I have never been comfortable with things I cannot enter in a column. Here is what I think now, with the distance of years. I think she came meaning to hate him, and hatred is a thing you can carry a long way if the man stays a story. A photograph on the back of which someone has written this is who killed him. But Silas would not stay a story. He got up before her every morning and broke the ice on the trough with his scarred hands so she wouldn't have to. He learned to say thank you in her language, badly, and kept saying it badly until it made her almost smile. He was gentle with her in the particular way of a man who is afraid of his own strength, which is a thing that only frightened men and men who have hurt people ever learn to be. I think she had prepared herself for a monster, and had found instead a murderer, and had discovered they are not the same thing, and that the difference was going to cost her everything she'd crossed an ocean to keep. The heavy day came in February. There'd been a break in the weather, a false spring that the mountains used to kill the hopeful, and Silas rode out to check the far fences and didn't come back by dark. May stood on the porch looking not east that night but west, toward where he'd gone, and I saw her hands work at each other, and I understood that I was watching a war. Because here was her chance. If he'd gone down out there, a fall, a horse rolled on ice, a leg broken 40 miles from help, the cold would do her work for her and no knife required, no sin on her own hands, just the simple withholding of a search. She could stand on that porch and do nothing and let the mountains close her account for her. I said, careful, we should go look. She didn't answer for a long moment. The wind took the smoke from the chimney sideways. Then she said, in her rationed English, the most words I'd yet heard her put together at once, "Get the lantern." We found him 2 hours out on foot, leading a horse gone lame, half frozen and furious with himself. And when he saw the lantern come bobbing through the dark, he stopped and stood swaying in the snow and said her name, May, like it was the only word he had left in him. She got to him before I did. She got under his arm and took his weight, this woman who didn't reach his shoulder, and she cursed at him in her own language in a tone that needed no translation. The tone of a person furious at someone precisely because they were terrified of losing them. And she got him up on my horse and walked the whole way back in the snow with her hand, fisted in the horse's mane so she'd know if he slid. I watched her save the life she'd come to end. And I watched her face while she did it, and it was not the face of a woman who'd changed her mind. It was the face of a woman who discovered her mind and her heart were now enemies, and that there was no lantern in the world that could show her the way through that particular dark. The photograph came out 3 nights later. I hadn't meant to be there. I'd come to the house for the account book I kept in the kitchen, and I heard voices in the front room, and I should have left, and I didn't, because I'm a watcher and it's the worst thing about me. She'd shown him the tintype. I understood that at once from the way he was holding it, both hands, the way a man holds something that has just detonated in the middle of his life. She stood across the room from him with the whole width of the floor between them, which she'd chosen on purpose, and she was speaking. More English than I'd known she had. She'd been saving it, I realized, saving her words for this. "His name," she said. "You will say his name." Silas looked at the tintype. His face had gone to the color of the snow outside. "I don't," he started. "You will say his name." Her voice didn't rise. It went lower, which was worse. "You do not remember so many, you do not count them." He counted. He wrote letters, every week letters to me, to our mother. He was going to bring us. He was going to. She stopped, steadied, went on. "The camp east, 3 winters, the men who came with guns over the pay. You were one. I know you were one. I have looked for 3 years. I sold everything I am to stand in this room. So you will look at his face, and you will say his name even if you must guess, even if it is wrong, because he was a person, and you made him into snow, and someone in this room will speak of him as a person before I." She didn't finish it, but we all heard the shape of the end of that sentence. "Before I do what I came to do." I stood in the kitchen doorway, and I did not breathe. And Silas Cade, I have to tell this part exactly, because it is the truest thing I ever saw a man do. Silas Cade did not lie. He could have, it would have been so easy. He could have said I wasn't there, you have the wrong man, I've never been east of this valley. And she had no proof but a face on tin and 3 years of a sister's certainty. He could have talked his way clear and let her doubt herself back across the ocean. Instead, he sat down slow, like his legs had quit, and he set the tintype on his knee, and he looked at it for a long, long time. "I was there," he said. The room stopped. "I don't know his name. You're right, I didn't count. That's the worst of it, I think, that I made myself not count, because counting would have meant I'd have to carry them, and I told myself if I didn't learn their names they weren't quite." His voice broke. He pushed through it. "That's a coward's arithmetic, and I've done it for years. I was there. I took money to make men leave a camp, and when they didn't leave fast enough, He stopped. His scarred hand had started to shake, and he pressed it flat against his own leg to still it. "I don't know if it was my bullet. I've told myself for 3 years I don't know. But I was there, and I raised my gun, and it doesn't matter whose bullet if I was one of the guns. He was your brother. He wrote letters. I didn't let him become a person to me because I couldn't afford to. There's no word. I'm sorry is a word children use for broken cups." He held the tintype back out to her, across the room, his arm shaking with the reach of it. I can't give him his name back. I don't have it to give. But I'll not lie to you about the one thing you crossed the world for. You have the right man. Whatever you came to do, you've got the right man to do it too. And then Silas Cade, killer, coward, the trying man, the man in the clean shirt, set the photograph down gentle on the table between them, and put his shaking, scarred hands in his lap, and bowed his head and waited. He gave her the killing. He just handed it to her, open-handed, and waited to receive it. I have kept books my whole life. I know what it looks like when a man decides to pay a debt he can never actually settle. That's what I was watching. He couldn't give the brother back. So he offered the only currency he had left, which was himself, and he did it without a single condition, and I understood in that moment that I had never once, in 11 years, truly known the man whose numbers I'd been keeping. May stood across the room and did not move to take up what he'd offered. She looked at his bowed head. She looked at the photograph. She looked at his hands, open now, empty still. And she made a sound I had never heard from her, a small, cracked, involuntary sound, the sound of something load-bearing giving way inside a person. And she pressed the back of her own hand hard against her mouth to stop it. And she turned, and she walked out of the house into the February dark without a coat. I started after her. Silas said, "Elias, leave her." His head was still bowed. He had not moved. "She's got no coat," I said. "Leave her," he said again, and his voice was the voice of a man who had just given away the last thing he owned and would not now presume to chase after it. "She's earned the right to stand in the cold and hate me without an old man watching. Both of us. We've earned that much for her. Leave her be." So I did. God forgive me, I did. I stood in that kitchen with a man who would not lift his head, and through the window I could see her out in the yard, a small dark shape against the snow, standing where she stood every night, but not looking east now, and not looking west toward where he'd nearly died. Looking up, at the whole cold wheel of stars over a country that had taken her brother and given her, in exchange, this impossible arithmetic she now had to solve alone. She stood out there a long time. I did not see what she decided. The window fogged with the kitchen's warmth, and by the time I'd wiped it clear she'd moved out of the frame, and I could not have told you then whether she'd gone to the barn where the tools were, or the road that led away, or simply further into the dark, to be alone with the ruin of the only certainty she'd had left. Silas never lifted his head the whole time. He just sat there in the offering position, hands open in his lap, waiting to learn whether he was going to be allowed to keep living, and having decided, I understood this too, watching him, that either answer was one he'd accept. She was still there in the morning. That's the first thing, and it's a bigger thing than it sounds. I lay awake all night certain I'd wake to find either a body or an empty road, and instead I woke to the smell of coffee with ginger in it, which meant that some hour in that terrible dark she had come back inside and chosen, at least for one more morning, to make a life instead of ending one. But she did not look at Silas, and he did not look at her, and the two of them moved around that kitchen like people avoiding a hole in the floor that only they could see. She set his cup down without a word. He said his bad thank you in her language, and she did not answer it the way she had all winter with the almost smile. The almost smile was gone. Something had taken its place that I didn't have a name for, a kind of exhausted watchfulness, the face of a person still holding a decision they hadn't set down. The false spring held. The snow began to rot off the low pastures, and with the thaw came the thing I should have seen coming, because trouble in that country always waited for the roads to open. 3 men rode up on a bright cold afternoon in the first week of March. I knew what they were before they reached the yard. You learn the sit of a man in a saddle who's carrying a gun for money. Silas himself had once sat a horse that exact way, easy and wrong, like violence was a comfortable chair. The one in front had a soft, reasonable face and hard eyes, and he called out a hello to the yard that had a smile in it and no warmth at all. Silas came out onto the porch. He'd been mending tack. He still had the awl in his hand. He did not have a gun. That was a choice he'd made months back that I'd noted in my ledger and never understood until much later. Silas had stopped wearing his gun around the ranch sometime in the winter, around the time I realized that he'd started breaking the ice for her. "Cade," the soft-faced man said. "Been a long time. Camp East, remember? You always were hard to find when the work went bad." I felt the whole afternoon tilt. They'd come about the camp. Not the law, never the law for that kind of killing, not out there. Someone had been asking questions in town. A Chinese woman had been looking for 3 years, and word travels, and old crimes have living owners who don't like the ground stirred. These were the other guns, the ones who'd been in the snow with Sila's 3 winters back. They'd heard someone was hunting them, tracing them one to the next, and they'd come to close the account the permanent way, starting, I understood, with a man softest enough to have quit the trade and grown a conscience out here where it couldn't hurt anybody but himself. "You brought your hunter right to your door, Cade," the soft man said, pleasant as anything. "That was careless. We'll take her off your hands. And you, seeing as you've gone soft and might talk, nothing personal, you know how it is. Loose accounts. I want to tell you Silas did something magnificent. He didn't. He was one man with an all and no gun against 3 mounted killers, and he knew exactly what that arithmetic came to, because he'd been on the winning side of it his whole life and knew there was no trick in it. What he did was step down off the porch, putting himself between the 3 men and the doorway of the house, where May was. "She's not part of this," he said. "She's a hired girl, cooks, doesn't know a thing about the camp or you or any of it. Let her be and I'll come quiet. You don't need a body you'd have to explain." He was lying. Finally, at the end, Silas Cade told a lie and told it to save the woman who'd come to kill him. The soft man laughed. "She's the one asking, Cade. Whole town knows it. Whole town's wrong. You want somebody. It's me. Been me from the start." He took another step, drawing their eyes, their gun hands, all 3, onto himself and away from the door. "Get down off your horses like men and let's have it done. Or are the 3 of you scared of one fellow with a bit of leather working?" I have thought a long time about why he did it that way, why he baited them, and I've come to believe it wasn't courage exactly, or not only. I think Silas had been waiting since February, since he'd bowed his head and offered her the killing and she hadn't taken it. I think he'd been waiting for a way to pay that didn't require her to become the thing she'd crossed the world to punish. He couldn't give her the brother. He couldn't take back the snow. But he could take the bullet meant for her, and in the taking, cancel the debt with the only coin she couldn't refuse. He was trying to die for her so she wouldn't have to become a killer because of him. It was the most selfish, generous thing I ever saw, and it very nearly worked, and it would have 3 guns, one all except for the thing none of them knew, the thing I hadn't fully known myself. They'd all made the same mistake Silas had made, the mistake I'd half made, the mistake the broker had made, the mistake the whole world makes about a small, still woman with rationed words. They thought May was the person who'd been found. She came out of the doorway behind Silas fast and low, and she had his gun, the one he'd stopped wearing. She'd known where it was, of course she'd known. She'd been in that house all winter cataloging his hands and his habits the way I catalog cattle. She'd known where every dangerous thing in that house lived since her first week. Because a woman who has crossed an ocean to kill a man learns the location of the weapons before she learns the location of the flour. She did not hesitate. That's the thing I keep coming back to. 3 years of hunting had made her hands sure in a way that Silas's gentle winter had not unmade. The soft-faced man was still smiling when she shot him off his horse. The other 2 were fast, but they were fast at killing men who fought back from the front. They weren't ready for the small, quiet woman, and they weren't ready for Silas, who, the instant the first shot cracked the afternoon open, moved like the thing he'd spent 11 years trying not to be, and drove the awl into the leg of the nearest horse so it screamed and reared and spilled its rider into the mud where a falling man is just a problem to be solved. It was over faster than it takes to tell. It always is. I'd written enough of the 3rd column to know that killing is quick and only the carrying of it takes years. When the noise stopped, there were 3 men down and the horses screaming and running, and Silas was on his knees in the mud with red spreading across the left of his shirt. His church shirt. He'd taken to wearing it around her. I only realized then, and May was standing over the soft-faced man with the gun still up and her whole body shaking. The soft man was alive, gut shot, dying but alive and looking up at her. And here it was, the heavy thing, the real one, the one the whole story had been walking toward since the wagon in the rain. She could finish him. He was one of the guns from the camp. He was, as much as Silas, the snow that had swallowed her brother. She had every right the world recognizes and several it doesn't. Her hand was steady enough now. All she had to do was let the anger of 3 years close his account, and she'd have what she came for at last, a body of a camp killer, paid in full, her own hand on the ledger. She looked at him a long time. Then she looked at Silas, kneeling in the mud, bleeding into his church shirt, having just tried to die so that she wouldn't have to do this exact thing. And she uncocked the gun. "No," she said, to the dying man, to herself, to 3 years. "No, my brother did not make men into snow. I will not become the thing that took him. You will die of what you already are. I will not make myself into you to do it." She turned her back on him. She let the mountains close his account, the way she'd once considered letting them close Silas's, but chosen, this time on purpose, in daylight, with the gun in her own steady hand. And she went to Silas in the mud and pressed her small hands against his church shirt to hold the blood inside him. "You are not permitted," she said to him, fierce, furious, her voice cracking to pieces. "You are not permitted to die and leave me the only one who remembers him. You will live. You will help me carry it. You do not get the easy way. You do not get the snow. You will stay and you will help me carry my brother because you are the only person on this earth who is there, and I will not carry him alone. I have carried him alone for 3 years, and I will not." He lived. I'll not pretend the doctoring was pretty or that it went smooth. It was 3 bad weeks and a fever that nearly took him after the bullet didn't, and it was May who sat through every night of it, and it was me who finally, in the small hours of the worst night, wrote the thing in my ledger I'd been avoiding for months. Not in the 3rd column where the dead men went, but in the front in the living accounts, a single line. May Cade of this ranch, because she'd stayed. Because whatever she'd come to be, she'd chosen to become something the arithmetic of that camp could never have predicted. They never spoke of love, those two, in any of the years I knew them after. It wasn't that kind of thing, and I'll not dress it up as one to make it go down easier. What they had was heavier than love, and I don't have a proper word for it. He'd made her brother into snow and could never unmake it, and she knew it every single day, and she stayed anyway, and he lived under the weight of her staying and never once acted like he deserved it. And somehow the two of them built a life on that ground that a happier arithmetic could never have built anything on at all. She taught me the characters, eventually, on the back of the tintype. Years later. It wasn't a name. It was a line from a letter her brother had written that she'd copied onto the photograph before she left home so she'd carry his words and not just his face. It said, "Sister, the country is hard, but the sky is very wide. Come, there is room here even for us." She kept the photograph on the mantel after that, in plain sight, where before she'd kept it hidden in red silk. Silas dusted it. I saw him do it once when he thought no one was watching, gentle with the scarred hand, and I had to go stand in the barn a while. I keep the books still. I'm too old for much else now. Cattle in one column, debts in another. The 3rd column I closed a long time ago. There's been no need of it since the March the roads opened. Some accounts you don't settle by adding to them. Some you settle by finally, after everything, deciding to stop. She still stands on the porch some nights, looking east. But she doesn't clutch the bundle anymore, and she doesn't stand alone. There's a second shape out there beside her most nights now, tall and stooped. A man in a worn-out church shirt, the two of them not talking, just standing, looking at the 4,000 miles and the very wide sky over the country that was hard and had, against all its own cruel arithmetic, somehow made room. I don't go out to them, some things you're not invited to. I just mark it down, one small true line at the end of a long day's tally. They're still here, both of them.